Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lecture, the George Knight's Memorial Lecture. My name's Stephen Fleming. I'm co-editor of Beecraft, and we have great pleasure in sponsoring this George Knight's Memorial Lecture. George Knights was a beekeeper. He died 25 years ago, or thereabouts. He lived in Reading. He was past president of the BBKA, and quite a phenomenal figure in beekeeping at the time. He was a sergeant major, so I can imagine what it was like when he managed the conventions. He organised a few conventions in his time. So we're delighted to sponsor this lecture and to have Professor Lars Chittka as the lecturer. Lars is Professor of Sensorial and Behaviour Ecology at Queen Mary University, London. Born in Germany, he studied biology at the Free University of Berlin, and in 2009 he founded the Research Centre for Psychology at Queen Mary University, London. So that seems a curious link to begin with. But today, Lars' work explores the crossovers between sensory physiology, learning psychology, and evolutionary ecology. But his work doesn't stop there. You may know of his other exploits. He explores the link between science, bees, and music, and he's the lead vocalist in Killer Queen Bees. A couple of the tracks there that I've looked at, The Beekeeper's Dream and I Stung Gwyneth Paltrow. I'm not sure if those segue together or not, but it's an interesting pairing. So, over to you, lead vocalist of Killer Queen Bees.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to give the George Knight's Memorial Lecture. So since we're already beginning with acknowledgements, I think I also want to introduce my co-authors on the work that we did, in part because no one ever listens to them at the end, so I'll say them right now. So what I'm going to tell you is by and large the work of Ellie Leadbeater, Quinn Solvey, Erica Dawson, Ollie Lukola, Sylvain Alain, and I bring some funding in so that these people can do their work. So when I first was invited to give this lecture, of course, I had to Google who was George Knight. And I found quite a number of hits, but I was quickly convinced that this wasn't the right George Knight. So I had to ask around a little bit, and fortunately, thanks to Sharon and Malcolm Blake, as well as Norman Carrick, I found some genuine obituaries which point to the fact that indeed he was an interesting character. Normally you don't find things in obituaries such as someone being, on the right here, deeply emotional, often annoyingly inconsistent in committees. The meetings he attended were often dramatic, but always creative and inspiring. He was a dynamic man, not always an easy colleague, and often needing a firm hand. I don't know what the author meant by that. But yes, he was an ex-soldier, and that might explain why he was sometimes a difficult character. He was part, of course, of a generation where pretty much across Europe all the males of fighting age were traumatized one way or another. He fought, as you can see on the bottom left there, in the initial withdrawal from France, and then in the battles of Boulogne and Dieppe and Normandy, Ardennes, Arnhem, Reichswald Forest, and so on. So these must have been difficult times. He started in the war as a 19-year-old, by my maths. And it seems, I guess, from checking today's news, that our generation took peace in Europe perhaps a little too granted. And of course, the European Union was one effort of welding formerly warring fractions together, and that is now again at risk, which is a great pity. Over to bees and understanding bees. When I talk about social intelligence, I don't just mean that metaphorically, but to some extent literally. Now, understanding bees is not easy, as you can see in this quote from Nobel laureate Maurice Maeterlinck, who observed the following. Let us suppose that an inhabitant of Venus or Mars were to contemplate us, humans, from the height of a mountain and watch the little black specks that we form in space as we come and go in the streets and squares of our towns? Would the mere sight of our movements, our buildings, machines and canals convey to him any precise idea of our morality, intellect, our manner of thinking and loving and hoping, in a word, our real and intimate self? All he could do, like ourselves, when we gaze at the hive, would be to take note of some facts that seem very surprising, and from these facts deduce conclusions probably no less erroneous, no less uncertain than those that we choose to form concerning the bee. Whither do they tend and what is it they do, he would ask, after years and centuries of patient watching. What is the aim of their life or its pivot? I can see nothing that governs their actions. The little things that one day they appear to collect and build up, the next they destroy and scatter. They come and they go, they meet and disperse, but one knows not what it is they seek. So there's the difficulty well laid out. What I will talk about is roughly this. So in many people's understanding, insects, including social ones, are a kind of reflex machines where people appreciate that their behavior is complex, that they can build magnificent structures such as this stingless bee spiral comb here. But the thinking is that this is a diverse repertoire of a kind of behavioral Swiss Army knife, of routines that are built into the insect, that there is not much thinking going on. And what I want to explore is the question of not just whether bees can learn, but because we're talking about social intelligence today, about whether they can learn from each other, the extent to which the dance language that you're all familiar with is an example of social learning. I want to ask if bees can learn things such as object manipulation from each other, and whether such techniques learned from each other can actually lead to kinds of behavioral traditions. And at the end, I want to ask whether these kinds of beautiful architectures that we see here could, at their root, have been in part the result of cultural processes. Now, there is superficial similarity between some of the outcomes of building activities in humans and in some social insects. So we have here a termite hill that is several meters high in comparison with the La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And the traditional thinking is that while the outcome is perhaps vaguely similar, that the processes underlying these constructions are wholly different. That in one case, in the human case, there is an architect who has a vision of the intended outcome and then passes on the idea to people who will then work to fulfill this plan. Whereas conversely, in insects, everything arises without a master plan, by just local interactions between individuals that are essentially stupid, that are just following a predetermined program of behavioral actions. And people have been thinking about this for quite a long time. Here's a quote from Swiss naturalist Charbonnet, who observed the following. He was, like many other scholars over the centuries, fascinated with the regularity and the mathematical perfection and the economy of honeycomb, and he had the following thoughts about how this might come about, this structure. Placed together in the same room, 10,000 automatons animated with a living force, and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. So it's interesting there that he assumes the notion of consciousness at the basis and the feelings of the bee about its architectures perhaps, and that as a byproduct of these cognitive processes, something that is as regular and symmetric and so on as the comb will just naturally arise by sticking all of these individuals together into the same room. Now, humans have plenty of experience with sticking together tens of thousands of individual animals together in a room. And somehow, something like the honeycomb, or indeed any architecture at all, does not normally just arise as a byproduct of having lots of animals in the same room. Okay, so it requires a little bit more than just sticking the animals together and then some magnificent building magically emerges. Now, the first person to investigate comb construction in bees in magnificent observations as well as experiments was François Hubert and his team. So he himself was blind, so he couldn't have done much of the work that is credited to him, including the writing. He worked jointly with his wife and his servant. In those days, people had servants, I guess, as a team. So he, of course, knew that bees would usually start their constructions, as you can see here, at the top, and then gradually work their way down along the direction of gravity to build their growing honeycombs. And his team wanted to observe how this worked, how bees gradually built these structure, and therefore experimented with replacing various walls with glass screens. And the first thing that he found was that the bees didn't like to attach their comb to glass screens when they had a choice. And so the first experiment that he did was using a glass ceiling. And what he found in that case is that the bees no longer would attach their comb to the ceiling as they usually would, but build the foundation at the bottom and build essentially a tower construction from the bottom up. Okay? You might say, well, that's still a robotic routine, it's still the same sort of process. But in its alignment with the direction of gravity, this is an inversion of the behavioral routines with the sensory input of gravity, right? So if you built a robot simply doing the construction routine like honeybees do in nature, start at the top, work down along gravity, the direction of gravity, that robot would already fall flat on its face if faced with this challenge. Okay? Now the next thing that Hubert and team then tried is, okay, if we present a glass ceiling and a glass floor, so they can't build either top-down or bottom-up, what would they do? And in that case, the bees started on one of the side walls and worked their way laterally through the cavity that the team had provided them with. Okay, so there's another degree of flexibility. But the next observation, I think, is the most impressive, because the team then replaced the target wall, the wall in the direction in which the comb was growing, with a glass wall after they'd already started the construction. So in the top image, there is our partial construction starting on one of the side walls, and once they'd reached that stage several centimeters away still from the target wall, they put a glass wall in the way. And what the bees did in that case, before they had reached the target wall, before they had reached the suboptimal outcome of trying to attach comb to a possibly slippery surface, is they curved the entire construction by 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wood wall. So this was the outcome. So the cells on one side of the curve were enlarged, they were reduced in size on the other side, and the whole construction curved to the nearest wood wall. The interesting observation there, which Hubert understood quite well, is that, of course, the bees made amendments for this construction before the suboptimal outcome was reached, before they had actually tried to attach the wax comb to the glass screen. And he acknowledged that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. Now, he claims in his book that they did this multiple times, always with the same result. Nonetheless, of course, these experiments await replication, and one of my PhD students, Vince Gallo, is currently exploring that. But it's an interesting early exploration of a process that seems to be, in this case, if these observations are to be verified, not just to be driven by robotic routines, but by some sort of appreciation of what the next stage of the construction would be like if we were to continue it in that direction. Now, much of the work that we do on learning and memory, unfortunately perhaps, because there might be quite a bit going on inside the hive, but much of it is focusing on the outside world of foraging bees, of bees' interactions with flowers. And that is certainly an interaction that requires a great deal of learning. You obviously have to remember the location of your hive, which in built-up environments where there are lots of human-made landmarks might be relatively easy. In proper undisturbed habitats, it's not a trivial task, and we'll come back to bee navigation tomorrow some more. The other main challenge, of course, is to find the best flowers. And for that, you have to often, if you're a generalist bee, sample multiple different species, evaluate, average over multiple visits their quality, and then associate colors, scents, and patterns, and so on, with the rewards that are to be had in the flowers. And in that context, and specifically in the context of honeybees, you realize I'll stray here and there to other bee species, most notably bumblebees in the talk, but the dance language is, of course, something that is unique to the genus Apis. And, well, you all know how the dance language works, presumably, or should I briefly explain it? No need for an explanation. So the dance language is, of course, to some extent a hardwired routine. Bees don't have to learn how to do it, nor do they have to learn how to interpret it. But I think it's often overlooked that in the course of the dance language, there is learning going on. The recruits attending the dance have to pick up the information from the dancing bee, decode it, and then subsequently apply it in spatial and temporal removal from the process of picking it up. So they can, using this symbolic language, pass on spatial information, but the picking up of that information involves not just decoding, but storing it in memory. And the dance language can, of course, be used with great versatility in a variety of contexts, not just in the context of locating the best flower patches, but also in locating new nesting locations. I'll come back to that in a moment. But in this context of the dance language, there was the first exploration by Martin Lindauer, who was a successful student of Carl von Frisch, exploring whether there might be something like a tradition in the timing in which bees prefer to forage over the course of the day. What's a tradition in the context of animals? So people who work with primates explore this quite a bit. And the way they define it is that you're looking at behavioral patterns that are found in some groups of an animal species, but not others. So birdsong is an example where you find this. These are behavioral patterns that are acquired by learning individually from others, and so are population specific and are not underpinned by genetic differences. And so in this experiment that Lindauer did with his student Wolfgang Kirchner, they trained bees to find food at certain times of day. And so they did the experiments in September when natural food was already scarce, so much of what the bees found was in the feeders that the experimenters offered to them. And if you look at the left column first, so here's a time scale over the course of the day from morning to evening, and one group of bees was trained to forage in the morning, and indeed when you then checked the feeders when there was no food available subsequently, then the morning bees foraged most strongly in the morning hours, midday bees in the midday, evening bees mostly, at least the peak was in the evening, and control bees were all over the place in terms of their preferred foraging hours. Now, what the experimenters then did is from the colonies trained to forage at certain times of day, they removed the brood combs, put them in a climate cupboard, and then once the workers hatched, added them to a new colony that had no relationship to the previous experimental colony. And the result of the forager temporal foraging preferences in this new generation, if you wish, of bees, they're of course not biological generations because the workers here weren't these ones' parents, but the idea of the behavior pattern being passed on from older bees to younger bees still holds. And so these bees that were raised in a climatized cupboard, basically, were then subsequently also early riser bees, the ones whose previous generation, so to speak, had been trained to forage in the evening, also preferred the evening. Midday, next generation bees preferred the midday, and so on. So these bees picked up from somehow, while they were still larvae, the temporal foraging preferences of older forager bees. And this was never fully explored. The notion by Lindauer and Kirchner how this could be passed on is because during the hours of maximum activity, most of the dancing took place. And of course, there's quite a bit of vibration in the combs, even at quite a distance from the location of the dance. And that these temporal preferences were thus imprinted on the larvae that were in the combs on which the dancing took place. So this was an early but interesting exploration of the notion of colony-specific traditions that could actually, in theory at least, be passed on over long periods. Now, both Martin Lindauer and later on Tom Seeley have explored the dance language in the context of consensus building in the honeybee swarm. Again, if everyone is familiar with this phenomenon, just say done, but I can talk you through how this consensus building works briefly if you want. Should I? Yeah. So as you know, when bees swarm, this is a very tiny swarm cluster. They typically settle on a nearby tree or a human-made building and sit there for hours, sometimes several days, and need to find a new home into which they can relocate. And needless to say, there is no tolerance for disagreement at the end. They have to agree on a common target. Okay, so half the bees can say, oh, we will go north, and the other half with the queen goes in another direction, and so on. So there has to be some unanimous agreement, ultimately. How do they do it? And so here's a figure from one of Tom Seeley's team's papers where they monitored the dances going on a swarm cluster like this over time. So each of these panels here is a 2-hour interval, and the swarm is at the center, and the arrows indicated here are numbers of bees dancing. So they use the same dance language as for indicating food while they're on the swarm, but indicating new potential nesting locations. And you can see that some of the arrows are very thick. Those are the ones that are most popular. The most dances indicate those locations. And some are very thin, so that's just a few bees having discovered a location, indicating it a few times, and then maybe giving up. Early in this process, so you can see that this is a process, in this case, over 3 days. So this is the 20th of July, 21st and 22nd. Early in the process, there's a great deal of disagreement. Scouts come back from multiple locations all over the swarm's range, indicated in their dances, and of course they disagree. Different scouts have found different places. Now, as you go over these 2-hour intervals, some destinations increase in popularity. So if you look at this destination due south, in this first 2-hour intervals, there's nothing much going on. Then it becomes really popular, even more popular, more popular. On day 2, it's still, this due south destination is still popular, but at the end of day 2 fades. And somewhere along the way, quite early on, they've discovered a southwesterly location where, again, the popularity changes, but in this case, largely tends to increase, until on day 3, all the dancers that dance at all indicate just one direction. And at that stage, shortly afterwards, the whole swarm will lift off and fly jointly to the new destination. So when this was discovered by Lindauer, Calvin Frisch observed him, well, congratulations, you've witnessed an ideal parliamentary debate. where initially there was lots of disagreement, and in the end everyone agreed on the same opinion, so to speak. How is it done? There's no one who counts the votes. There's no one who values all the votes and then makes a decision. Instead, it turns out that the process is largely and very elegantly decentralized in the following way. Scouts that have found a better destination indicated for a longer period of time. Scouts that have found a so-so destination indicated also, because you never know, that individual scout doesn't know if ultimately the swarm will find anything better, so they will also indicate it, but briefly. Now, for any random bee walking around on the swarm, that means that random bee has a higher chance of bumping into a dancer that has better information, right? Because a bee with better information will just say her speech this over and over and over again, okay? So she'll say north, north, north. Is this north? No. Whatever. This way, this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, sometimes for several minutes. Another bee that also has found something where you could possibly nest, but it's not great, will say this way, this way, this way, and then stop. And that means by simple stochastic processes, there's higher chances of picking up your information from a knowledgeable individual with good, high-quality information than from another individual that does not have as good information. The bees who attend the dances will then inspect the locations themselves, return to the hive, and again have a quality calibrated dance where they will indicate it for longer if the location is high quality and shorter if it's not. So the whole process snowballs through that exchange of social information until everyone has the same opinion. I've left a few details out, but this is how largely this consensus building comes about over time. Now, we've known this for decades, of course, from Lindauer's and von Frisch's work. Something that we hadn't known so much about is the extent to which bees can pick up information from observing other bees away from the hive, in flower patches, for example. And so if you're an entirely naive bee, on your maiden flight, you've never seen flowers before, and there might be dozens of species in your environment, then a reasonable first guess is, if you're trying to sample flowers, is where there's a great deal of activity, that must mean that this is a reasonable flower species for you to forage from. And that, of course, can be a shortcut to sampling dozens of species. And so there is some reason, at least, to assume that attending to other bees' activities in the field could be a reasonable first guidance to high-quality flower patches. So here's our entirely naive forager, and if he has the option of sampling all of the species you see in this meadow, or just going where conspecifics already forage, that might be a good idea. And Ellie Leadbeater and some of our other students in my team explored this phenomenon in the laboratory. So what you can see here, these are Bombus terrestris bumblebees, are two flower species, so to speak. So this is, we often have very simple setups. This is a flower reduced to just a color circle and a little balcony on which the bees can collect sugar water. And so you can see here that there's quite a bit of foraging activity on the orange flowers, not the green ones. And that's because the green ones don't actually offer any food. Here's an observer bee who's trying to come in here, but we've put a screen in the way so she can see what's going on behind the screen, but she can't actually fly in there while the foraging is going on. So we do that for some time. Then we remove the flower board, remove the foragers, put a new flower board that's clean and has no food or scent marks on it. So here's our observer bee, and then we ask that individual afterwards, if she's now giving a bee-free and clean set of flowers, where do you go? And it turns out that in this case, the bee will indeed go to the orange flowers. If we've had the demonstrators, as we call them, on the green flowers instead, then that bee will prefer the green flowers. So just by observing from a distance, Without direct interactions with these trained demonstrators, these bees know where to go. And the idea of bees learning from each other, again, is not necessarily new. It's often it's a healthy, humbling experience to dig deep into past centuries' literature, because lots of good ideas have, of course, been expressed before by more clever people than oneself. Darwin observed honeybees drinking from holes that had been made by bumblebees in flowers. So what I've rather flippantly here called good bee and bad bee is the phenomenon that bumblebees like Bombus terrestris, which actually have relatively short tongues, will not necessarily extract the nectar in the way that that's good for the flower by entering through the front door, but they will sometimes bite holes at the base of a spur of a flower and extract nectar without touching any of the reproductive parts. And that's called nectar robbing. And Darwin observed that when bumblebees used this technique, honeybees would do the same shortly afterwards. And what he wrote about that is, I think the hive bees either saw the humblebees, they called them humblebees in those days, cutting the holes and understood what they were doing and immediately profited by their labor, or that they merely imitated the humblebees after they cut the holes. Should this be verified, it will be a very instructive case of acquired knowledge in insects. We should be astonished. Did one genus of monkeys adopt from another a particular manner of opening hard-shelled fruit? How much more so ought we to be in a tribe of insects, so preeminent for their instinctive faculties, which are generally supposed to be in inverse ratio to the intellectual. These were just observations at the time, of course, and we did a whole bunch of experiments showing that much of what Darwin assumed from simple observations like this was likely correct. So we have found that, number one, or rather my student Ellie Leadbeater found that bumblebees can indeed learn the technique of nectar robbing just by observing other bees that practice the technique. We've also found that bumblebees can learn flower color preferences by observing honeybees' color preferences, and vice versa, honeybees can learn from bumblebees. We haven't yet explored, it has to be said, we have not explored whether honeybees can learn the nectar robbing technique just by observing bumblebees. So that part of verifying Darwin's idea is still missing. Now, when I gave these kinds of presentations to colleagues who work with primates and clever corvid birds and so on, they always said, yeah, well, that's all very impressive, but the kind of learning that you're looking at is still very much in the context of what a bee needs to do all the time. It's interactions with flowers, it's finding out which flowers are most rewarding. That's not impressive. And they said, we do deliberately use experiments for their animals which they do not naturally encounter, but where the whole idea of testing their behavioral flexibility and intelligence is to put them on the spot with techniques that no animal in their evolutionary history has ever had to do. And I thought, all right, well, we can try that as well. And so one of the techniques that these people used was a so-called string pulling technique with primates. And I bet that our bumblebees could do it too, and here's a bumblebee who does it. So the technique is, string pulling experiments are where you need to pull on a rope to retrieve an item, a food morsel, for example, that's otherwise out of reach. And indeed, we could train bumblebees to do that. So here, that's, by the way, was the first bee that we ever trained on this technique, and you can see that she's still a little clumsy, but clearly she doesn't land stupidly just on top of the blue flowers, but she flies in a directed manner to where you can pull the string and so on. But not only that, bumblebees can also learn this technique by observing each other. Here are two bees, one marked with a red dot and another one not. The red dotted bee is an experienced individual, one that's already figured out the technique. The one that's not marked is wholly naive. Okay, she has no idea how to get to the reward. And once the experienced individual has pulled out the flower, the unexperienced one just scrounges on the reward and they share the reward, and now they're happily drinking it together. Now they're getting a bit twitchy because they've used up the reward, and you can see in a second that the experienced bee will run over to the next flower and start its work there, whereas the inexperienced one is still faffing about thinking, well, there must be something here after all. But there isn't, and then of course she realizes that the demonstrator has gone. She runs over to the demonstrator and again scrounges on that experienced bee's efforts. Now if you do that a number of times, the inexperienced bees can take over the technique by themselves and become themselves demonstrators for more bees. And you can do that even when bees are observing again behind a glass screen. They will still search in the right direction. Now they're onto the third flower, and again the inexperienced one, it takes a while to catch up, but she's clearly very interested in where the other bee is and what she's doing. And you can do that with an entire colony. So this is equivalent to a cultural process in humans where a new meme spreads or a new technology invention. At the top here is a single experienced individual that we've trained, and arranged in a big circle here are all the foragers of that bumblebee colony. Okay? Each bumblebee individual has initially a gray dot. Once there has been an interaction between a demonstrator, an experienced individual, and another bee, there's a line that's formed. And when these dots become colored, that means the target individual is now doing the technique themselves. And you can see that at this stage already, multiple individuals here have orange dots, and that's all the bees that learned it from the yellow bee. Okay, so that's our second generation of learners, so to speak. Now here is a purple individual. That's one that has not picked up the technique from the original yellow bee here, but from one of the orange bees. And as we continue, more and more purple bees will emerge, bees that have learned the technique from bees that have learned the technique from the first demonstrator. Okay? And you can continue this for the entire colony, and the process even continues after the initial successful demonstrator dies. So even when the original experienced individual is no longer active, the spread of the technique continues to include more and more individuals until it basically includes all the foragers of a colony. Yesterday someone asked me how drunk we must have been to do this particular experiment. There is another experiment that involved alcohol, but I might return to that tomorrow. This one didn't actually. We wanted to get further away from the string pulling idea to make things a little bit more difficult for our bees by actually them using a kind of object that was not directly attached to the reward, but an object that actually had to move into a defined destination. And we experimented with various sort of little sticks, and the bees were a bit clumsy at doing that. So in the end we thought, what could we use, what kind of object can we use that the bees can actually manipulate? So the task here is to get this ball from the periphery into the yellow goal area. And there goes the bee. And once she's got it in the target area, a little lid opens, then imbibes the reward. So far so good. But the interesting thing here is that because we're thinking about cultural processes, of course what you want is not just a stable tradition, but the possibility to improve techniques. And what we're seeing here is we now have 3 balls, 1, 2, 3, at different distances from the target. We again have a demonstrator bee that is familiar with the technique and an observer that is not. And we've played a little trick here in that this ball and this ball, the ones that are closest to the target area, are glued down. And the demonstrator knows that. So she's experienced this multiple times. She knows to get my reward, I have to move the furthest ball to the target area. And so this is what the naive individual gets to see for 3 sequential times. So here's that in action. So the experienced bee rolls the ball backwards, puts it in the center, and then they both get a reward. And this naive individual shares the reward again, but she has no experience with rolling balls. She just observes for 3 times. Okay? And then we ask the previously naive individual that's now observed the skilled demonstrator for 3 times, how would you solve the task? And if this observer merely aped the demonstrator, just copied the action that she has seen the demonstrator perform, that bee would now roll the furthest ball into the center. But what she does instead, typically, is pick the closest ball. You can see that she's very clumsy because she has no experience with ball rolling, but they invariably pick the closer balls rather than the furthest ones. So there's not a stupid kind of aping, a copying of whatever the technique is that they've observed, but a spontaneous improvement that allows to solve the problem in a better manner. And so we have a few ingredients here of bees learning from each other, copying techniques, even if they weren't previously ever in these bees' evolutionary history part of their natural repertoire, spontaneous improvements of such techniques and spread through entire colonies that are all ingredients that we pride ourselves on in human cultural processes. Now, let's imagine that an alien scientist had looked for signs of intelligent life perhaps 3 million years ago and visiting this planet. That scientist wouldn't have been particularly impressed with ancient hominins. Okay? They were just another social group of mammals with loose groupings that would perhaps occasionally use simple tools such as sticks. Well, some social insects would have done that as well, so they would have also found wasps that seal their burrows with pebbles and sometimes use pebbles to pound the sand around their nest to make the sand more solid. But that alien scientist would, I think, have been more impressed with what she would have found in bees, so with their magnificent honeycomb constructions or these kinds of alien or strange cities that I'll show you in a moment in a bit more detail. So if you think about it, the evolutionary behavior innovations that alien scientists would have observed across social insects, including sort of agriculture-like processes where leaf cutters bring leaves home to grow fungi on them, mathematically optimal solutions of storing larvae and food, these sort of, at least by the scale of insects, multi-story constructions, sophisticated division of labor, and so on. Here are some of what I think are perhaps for me the most magnificent structures anywhere among the social insects. So these Partamona stingless bees, these are Amazonian bees, nest in arboreal termite nests. They build their entrance structures that in some species at least, they only use white river sand. Okay, so they fly specifically to riverbanks where there's very lightly colored sand and then assemble these kinds of structures, which in some species are not just to mark the individual nest entrance. You can see there are multiple nest entrances in this nest, so they individually identify the correct nest, but there are also phenomena that they fly into these funnels at full speed and slide down into the funnel without the need to slow down, which of course would expose them to predation risk from lizards and so on that might lurk there. Look at this fantastic Partamona city. This is one of these species that nest inside arboreal termite nests. You can see down here is the entrance, and then immediately following the entrance is a fake nest, a cavity including fake brood chambers, diluted honey that is not very nutritious. And also this fake nest often contains a very large force of guard bees that will defend the colony in case any other insects, for example, invade. Then there is a kind of a fish trap style extended tunnel reaching into this cavity, and this is the tunnel that then actually leads to the real nest, which is up here. The honey pots and pollen pots are separate from the brood chambers. The brood chambers, which is of course the most precious commodity, so some of these structures are actually placed on stilts, which were not attached to any of the side walls, because that way any invading ants, wasps, and so on could easily reach them. They're on these narrow stilts, which can be very easily defended, of course. And remarkably, in many of these, quite a bit of variation between not just species, but within species. And so I think it's exciting to explore in such cases the extent to which these differences are not hereditary, but might be cultural. Because many of these colonies persist for multiple decades. So unlike, let's say, our bumblebees, which always collapse at the end of the season, and thus with them all their knowledge will collapse and cannot be passed on to the next generation, here at least that's feasible. Now, if our alien scientists had returned to planet Earth 300,000 years later, they would have still found the same thing. They would have found that ancient hominids are still as primitive as before, with just using very simple sticks that they found here and there. Bees would have still constructed the same hexagonal combs. These wasps would have still used simple stone tools. And she might have concluded, the scientist, that, well, after all, there is no intelligent life on Earth. All of these species operate simply by hardwired routines which stay constant over hundreds of thousands of years. Indeed, by the way, humans for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years had no evolution at all of the kinds of tools that they were using. If you look at historic arrowheads or spear constructions, they were often identical for tens of thousands of years, so no visible progress. However, that scientist, if she'd taken back both the hominins and the social insects into the laboratory and tested their learning abilities, she would have found that both the hominins and the bees were actually pretty smart, not just at learning things, but also learning from each other, and might wonder, well, why haven't they got any further? And so the answer might be that the scientist might have simply looked at the wrong moments in time on planet Earth to find cultural evolution. Of course, the most exciting time in those terms in humans was in the last few thousand years. And the rapidity of the progress there is very obvious. Given what we now know about social insects' learning abilities and the possibility of spreading new innovations culturally, plausible that at the roots of all of these magnificent architecture constructions, learning processes might also have played a role, and that these simply were cemented into innate routines much later, before the alien scientist made her two points in time visits 300,000 years apart. Let's return to Maurice Maeterlinck briefly, because I've introduced him at the start. He asks, what have we to do, some will ask, with the intelligence of the bees? The discovery of a sign of true intellect outside ourselves procures us something of the emotion Robinson Crusoe felt when he saw the imprint of a human foot on the sandy beach of his island. We seem less solitary than we had believed. So the conclusions from this talk is that, of course, in the dance language, we have a kind of symbolic communication system that actually functions as a social learning system, as one where individuals learn by observing, in some sense, each other, although it's a tactile observation, so to speak, where to go. Bees can learn from each other which flowers to visit and how to manipulate objects. There is evidence, at least from such laboratory experiments, that they can quite well form behavioral traditions that spread through entire populations. And it's therefore at least plausible and worth exploring by scientists whether some of the most impressive accomplishments in social insect architectures and the behavioral innovations might at their very roots have been the result of such cultural processes. And I'll leave you there. I'll give another talk tomorrow about the mind of the individual bee if you're curious, but I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Chittka. I now realised, as a magazine editor, I'm an inexperienced nectar-robbing bad bee, as opposed to your creative, inventive, demonstrator good bee. That really was fantastic. I've learned a lot from that and be watching my bees ever more carefully. We're open for questions now. There's a roving mics around.
Wonderful talk. How do you train the first bee to pull the string? And the same question about how do you train the first bee to put the ball in the middle?
Good question. So the vast majority of bees that we worked with needed a kind of stepwise training. I should say there were, of over 100 individuals in that study, there were 2 that figured it out spontaneously. So they had been pre-trained, all of the bees had been pre-trained to visit blue flowers. So they knew that blue flowers contained reward. And with 2 individuals of a very large number, once we put the flower fully under the plexiglass table, 2 individuals figured it out by themselves with a lot of long-winded trial and error procedures. The others need to be trained either by us in a stepwise way where we first make the flowers openly accessible, then gradually push them under the plexiglass in a stepwise manner until they're fully concealed, and then they have to pull them out all the way. Or they learn it by interacting with other individuals that have already learned the technique. They learn best from other bees, better than from us. And with balls, likewise, the way we first did it, because we already knew how bees responded to other bees, with the ball rolling technique, we started by using a little plastic bee dummy that we had put on the end of a transparent glass stick, so it looked like a real bee, and made that, used that dummy bee to roll the ball while the other bee was in attendance.
Unbelievable. So do you propose a BIQ then?
I mean, yes, for whatever psychological experiments that we're doing, whether it's color learning or these more complex tasks of object manipulation, there are huge inter-individual differences. There are some bees that would rather die than learn or forage. And others are extremely quick on the uptake. And remarkably, if we test individuals that are good at one thing, let's say color learning, these bees tend to be also good at other learning experiments. So there seems to be a kind of elevated IQ in some individuals where they're smarter and faster learners across the board and others not.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Question just up behind. Behind.
You indicated that the bees amplify the importance of what they're saying by iterative movement. As it becomes more and more sophisticated, do different bees' information rank differently? In other words, does the dance change? Do you understand the question?
I'm not sure, but I think I do. So one problem with the bees in this regard is that at least most social bees are very hard to tell apart individually, both for us as well as for other members of their colonies. So it's very hard to identify a particularly good role model as being a more valuable carrier of information than others. However, that's not the case in some wasp species. So there are some Holstein wasp species with low numbers of individuals in a colony, but very highly distinct facial features. And they can recognize one another individually and also store quite a bit of information.
Are they perhaps a bit more intelligent than bees?
Sorry?
Are they perhaps a bit more intelligent than bees?
At least in terms of social intelligence and the question of storing information about other individuals, yes. Right. With other techniques or other IQ tests, if that's what you want to call them, we don't know that yet about the wasps. But what we can do, of course, with bumblebees is make them more individually distinguishable than they naturally are. And so one of my students, Eric Romero, marked bumblebees with individual large colored dots on their thorax and then tried to find out whether observer bees can indeed figure out what's a particularly reliable demonstrator in terms of pointing out the best colors of flowers. And indeed, once you highlight these individual differences that are not naturally there, indeed they can do that.
Which we do have in human society quite naturally.
Yeah, of course, we are both individually easily recognizable typically, and we amplify these differences by highlighting our uniqueness with clothes or haircuts and so on. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Other questions? Someone up here? Any further questions? Yes.
So it's just, I remember coming to a talk previously here where it was, it basically said that bees had smelly feet. And
Bees
in the
had
same smelly feet, they have glands in their feet
Mm-hmm.
that leave a smell. And in the same way that slugs and snails use their slime to show trails to food, could it be that bees are following their noses? And also thinking about the sort of sensory dominance that you might get across different bees and how that might influence their behaviours.
Yeah, so I mean, all social insects live in a world that is very rich with scent, both from their environment, the world of flower scents, as well as the ones that they use inside their colonies. And you're right, of course, the fact that bees have smelly feet means, for example, that they leave behind traces of bee smell on the flowers that they have recently visited, which in turn can be used by other bees to gauge that, okay, that flower is recently visited, no point in going there because someone will have emptied it. Again, the remarkable thing is that this is not a hardwired response, because you can train bees to invert the aversion to flowers that smell of smelly bee feet by experimentally making sure that such smelly flowers actually have more reward, in which case the learned association is precisely the other way around. It is also true that in addition to the honeybees' dance information that they convey inside the nest, they can also mark the destination with the Nasonov gland, which they also use at the hive entrance. So if you give them a very rich feeder, they will also release that same pheromone at the feeding station. And in some stingless bees, they indeed lay complete scent trails by intermittently landing on vegetation, and in that way marking, they don't have a symbolic language like the dance language, but they do have a way of guiding nestmates to a target by just putting intermittent scent signposts along the way from the nest to a target.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about how you might mitigate some of those things in your experiments. Did you sort of have a completely new set of equipment every time?
Oh yes, so this is very important. Yeah, so if you do not eliminate scent marks from most of these experiments before we're testing individuals, then that's actually all they follow. So it's really, really important to make sure that we present them with clean colored targets and strings and whatever we use in an actual test. Yeah.
Okay. Right, thanks.
Any more questions? No? Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Chittka. I'm quite sure George Knights would have been astonished to hear a lecture 24 years later on this topic. Absolutely fascinating. We all look forward to The Mind of a Bee, your publication, which is due out in July, but is now available on pre-order on Amazon. Jerry of Northern Bee Books, sorry. Thank you very much indeed, Lars. That was
Thank you.